This is Colin O'Keefe here for LXBN TV. HOA elections are vital to the continued success of any community association. The thing is, they aren't always the easiest thing in the world to pull off. Joining me now to share some thoughts on best practices and some common missteps with these elections is attorney Liz White. She's with LeClairRyan in Williamsburg, an author on their blog, the Virginia Community Association Law Blog. Liz, first off, let's start off with some of the best practices. What are some proactive steps that community associations should take to make sure that their HOA elections go off without a hitch?
Well, thank you. Obviously, the devil's in the details. So making sure that you pay attention to the details, particularly the legal details and the corporate details, is very important. A lot of what we see by the time it makes it to our doorsteps as lawyers is that there's something's on fire, or we're getting something last minute and we uncover some pretty big issues. So it's really important to plan ahead, and oftentimes that can be overwhelming for volunteers or managers who are struggling just to get the logistics of getting the meeting space, or maybe how do we send this to the printers for the mail out of the notice package. But really, the devil's in the details here, making sure that you know your governing documents, you involve corporate counsel sooner than later. In terms of best practices, it's very helpful, I think, to have a committee or at least a designated board member who oversees the election process and attends to the details on the corporate side. Managers often are left holding the bag with things like HOA elections, and sometimes that may work out okay. We have a saying in the industry here that everything's okay until it's not. A lot of times associations get complacent with elections. Maybe they think it's just a matter of showing up and voting. They don't pay attention to things like quorum requirements, what can and can't be accomplished with a proxy, the difference between proxies and ballots, setting a record date, how are they going to run the check-in process when people show up, what are the checks and balances to make sure that the vote counters don't engage in dishonest conduct, that kind of thing.
Definitely. It always pays to be proactive, and of course you don't want things to reach your desk before it's too late for anything to be done about it. And then second, speaking to that, what are some of the biggest mistakes or missteps that you frequently see when it comes to these HOA elections?
Well, the first mistake I typically find is with the mailing out of the notice package. So oftentimes there's an informal mail out that may or may not comply with the requirements of your governing documents and state law. And the interesting thing is that every state has laws with respect to non-profit or non-stock corporations, and most HOAs are formed as a corporation. So if your HOA or condominium association is formed as a corporation, then you not only have to pay attention to what your governing documents say, your articles, your bylaws, your declaration, but you also have to pay attention to the corporate specific act in your state. And sometimes governing documents actually conflict with that act. So just following what's in your governing documents, what you got at closing or what your manager's given you and said, this is your package of governing documents, may or may not get you to where you need to go, depending on whether or not those documents comply with the applicable state law. So knowing that the state law is out there, a lot of times volunteers are very conscientious about making sure that they comply with their governing documents, but they don't know the other detail that's in the law. So the notice package is really where a lot of it starts. But even before the notice package goes out, how do you go about nominating individuals from your community or potential candidates for the board? And what's the selection process? Is it fair? Is it well communicated? Does it comply with your governing documents? Are you required to have a nominating committee? If so, what is the job description for that nominating committee? And if there's not one, you better find one and get one in place that makes sense for your community. So going back to that and this overall sense of fairness, building in the checks and balances. Once the notice package goes out, oftentimes what we see is a failure of either the volunteers or the professional manager, if you're fortunate enough to have professional management, in terms of looking at the details of how the meeting is going to, how it's going to work, how the space is going to interface with the legal requirements, Are you going to have people checking people in? How are you going to make sure your quorum is met? What are you going to do about homeowners who may be in arrears and assessments? Are they going to be eligible to vote? How are you going to handle that, knowing that we have the Federal Fair Debt Collections Practices Act, and anything dealing with collections has to be handled discreetly? Whether or not you've had a record date, so you even know who your members are and time to figure that out. If you're using directed proxies, how are you going to ensure that the directions on the proxy are actually followed by the proxy holder when the proxy holder goes to cast that ballot? So these are the types of details that when you're in that last minute crunch to get the chairs set up for the meeting and make sure security hopefully is present, making sure that the heat or the air conditioning is turned on, that you have somebody directing traffic, these types of details often fall by the wayside. And so when elections are challenged, we often see, the results of the fact that the details haven't been followed. Do you have a process for counting the ballots? How is that going to work? How are you going to marry up the directed proxies and ballots? And who's going to check them? If you have a requirement for anonymous voting or voting being confidential, what do you do with the directed proxy situation when you have an obligation to check those proxies? When you get back to the vote counting room, if you're not fortunate enough to be using a voting machine, and most associations here nationally are still doing some old-fashioned kind of check the box or fill in a blank or fill in a circle type of ballot. When you get back to the voting room, how are you going to ensure that the counting of the ballots is done accurately, that there's checks and balances? Are you going to let candidates observe the voting process or the vote counting process? Are you going to disqualify certain people from assisting with the vote counting process? It's those types of details that come in. And even to the point of once you have who your candidates are that are going to fill the empty board seats, how are you going to announce that to the membership when you walk back into the room? And are you going to say that Stan got, for example, 150 votes, but Mary got 148, and then go down the list of candidates and announce the number of votes? We're big advocates in the industry for not announcing the vote counts, because that can also add an element of adversity or just unhappiness, if you will, for the candidates who were brave enough to put their names forth.
Absolutely. As you discussed, there are a lot of details to be worked out, and the earlier that you work those out, the better. Once again, that was Liz White of LeClairRyan. For more of her insight from that and her colleagues, be sure to visit VirginiaCommunityAssociationLaw.com. Thank you for joining me today, Liz.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.